Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Joonas Lehtinen.
And I'm Marcus Hellberg.
So we are broadcasting here from the California offices of Vaadin. We have been asked quite a bit about the best practices, how to use Vaadin. So we decided that we maybe should discuss this topic a bit.
Yeah.
And I guess it might be also be fair to say that this is more of a tips and tricks or how to avoid potholes on the road type of webinar rather than having a complete list of best practices how you should do
Yeah.
your Vaadin applications.
Yeah.
So let me switch to slides. So first, I think it should be noted that Vaadin is really unopinionated framework. Basically, starting from the beginning of Vaadin from 15 years back, we have been quite consistent on not putting any restrictions on how you're going to be using framework. This is a UI framework, and we have been solely focused on the UI layer.
Yeah.
So we have been trying to kind of give as much freedom as possible for you. And
Sure. But that being said, I think there are definitely better and worse ways of accomplishing some things. There are some potholes, as you said, that you probably want to avoid. So in this webinar, we'll discuss a few of them. There'll probably be more of them. So if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the forum while we're talking. I don't know if we'll have time to go through them during the webinar, but we'll definitely go through them afterwards and try to give you some answers on those.
yeah, kind of, if you think about the freedom, it's really nice thing that you can build anything with Vaadin. You can make that work really well with your application if you know what you want to accomplish with that. But of course, that's kind of lack of guidance as well. So it's really, really hard to compromise between those two things. But let's get started.
Yeah.
And we'll start from the details. So first off, about the navigation.
Yeah, so we often get a lot of questions on how you should use the navigator. We got a couple of questions actually on how to do logins in our applications. And the navigator is really the glue that holds together most Vaadin applications. And this is one place where you can either make or break the kind of memory usage of your application. So let's take a look at what we can do with the navigator to A, handle login, and B, just keep the memory usage in checks.
Just going to point out, this is actually some of the first places where we had added some opinionated things in the framework. Vaadin 6 didn't have any navigator, so we kind of added navigation in Vaadin 7 just to kind of make it easier to build navigations, as basically every application has a navigation.
Exactly. So I'll show you an application running on my computer in just a moment, but just on a high level, what you want to do is that unless a user is logged in, you typically don't want to create the navigator and register the views to that navigator. By not doing that, you're not exposing the views to anyone that's not authenticated. Of course, if you have an application that has a certain set of functionality available to non-logged in users and then an extended set of functionality and views available to logged in users, then you would need to create the navigator at the start of the application, but when a user logs in, you want to register the rest of the views.
Or could you even create completely different navigator after that? Or
I guess you could. The idea is that by not registering views that people don't have access to, you're not exposing them to just people having the URL to some place that they shouldn't be allowed to access.
So what you're doing here is basically having a separate login view. Would it be a good idea to do this with JSPs?
You could do it with JSPs. Some customers do it with JSPs. I don't know if I personally don't use JSPs all that often for logins. I guess you.
Yeah, I guess the kind of good side of using a JSP over here is that then when people log out from your application, they basically end up back to that JSP, basically not having any Vaadin application in memory at that time. So it might save a bit of memory. Although I think it's a bad compromise, because then you would have to make sure that your JSP looks more or less the same as the application. You end up duplicating CSS and
And really, when you're logging out of your Vaadin application, you should make sure that everything gets released and the session size of an empty Vaadin application isn't really
that should
really
be
all
lightweight, like 20K or something like that.
Exactly. And one more thing you want to notice is the navigator.navigate to get state, and maybe we can switch over to my screen and I'll show why we have that. So here we have the application running, and once we log in, you can see that we display the application. And the reason why I have this, let's see here. The reason I'm navigating to get state here is that in many cases, you want to be able to bookmark some specific part of the application. So if we were to log out now and go here, you see that the application, since we're not logged in, we're going to show the login view. And once we log in, that call to navigator.navigate to get state will make sure that we get forwarded to the
so
place that we were
you get
going.
automatically to the correct place in your application.
Yeah, correct. The second part is
I can switch back to this one.
Yeah, I guess let's go through the slides and then I'll show them afterwards. So the second part I typically recommend you doing is using constant for view names, just because typos do happen, especially say you go and change the name of your view at some point, and if you're using just the string name of the view throughout the application, there's a very good chance that you're going to miss that someplace.
Yeah, kind of Java is one of the best things in Vaadin. You get static typing for free, so why not use that everywhere?
Yeah. So in this case, I've just defined a static final string for the view, and that way I can use that for adding it to the navigator, and then I can reference the same constant from other places and make sure that I don't typo it. In the demo app that I have here, I've taken this a little bit further, so I've defined my own annotation. This is kind of going a little bit overboard, but the benefit here is that I've been able to not only define the URI, but also some other meta info about this, like the display name and things that I can then, when I register the view, I'm able to use that information for putting it in the navigation bar, updating the title, and so on.
And all the examples you see over here, Markus collected these in one application that we have in GitHub, so we'll post the link right after the webinar.
Correct, yeah. So if there's something that you don't catch here, you're wondering, go in and check it in GitHub and ask us questions later on. Okay, so registering views. This is really a critical part where you can really go either wrong or right, in my opinion. Joonas might have a different opinion here.
I think that's kind of, I'm the one to blame, because the most approachable looking API would be where you passed instance instead of class, and that's not really the best way to do it.
So here you have the two variants of the add view API. You have one that takes in an instance and one that takes in a class. And of course, the first one that takes in an instance means that that instance will get instantiated when the navigator gets created and the views are added. So if you have tens of views, they will all get instantiated at that point. And what makes it kind of worse is that all of those views will be kept in memory because the same instance needs to be returned every time we come back to that view.
There is also one thing, you might be able to avoid some of this by basically initializing your views in the attach listener or attach method. But if you do everything in constructor, you might end up actually building a lot of component trees. Basically, when you log into the application, that would be really slow.
So in general, I recommend that you register your views using the class variant of the API. That means that a new instance will be created every time you go to a view, and when you navigate away from the view, that view will be eligible for garbage collection.
And there is a bad side as well, because if you want to go back to that particle view and you want to kind of keep the basically contents of that view or state of that view in memory and kind of have those when you navigate back, you kind of lose those.
Yeah. So if you have that kind of requirement, I would still recommend doing something like this. So I've registered a lazy provider, and basically what this does is it's extending the basic class-based constructor, but it keeps in memory the instance that gets created. So we don't create it up front before the user actually gets to the view the first time, but after that we're always returning the same. So at least we're cutting down on the kind of startup overhead of the application. Yeah. View change listeners are something that's really important in the navigator, or something that's very handy. So by attaching a listener to the navigator, you're able to both have events that happen before and after the view change. In this case, as an example, I've created a page title updater. So you remember that view config annotation I had on my view. So basically what this does is that when we navigate to view, it listens for that, and then it takes that display name from there and updates the page title based on that. There's also a before view change there. So if you need to, that actually returns a Boolean. So if you need to, for some reason, kind of abort the view change.
Cannot check if you have pressed the save button or something like that.
Yeah, so that would be a good example. So if you have unsaved changes, you can, for instance, abort the navigation away from a page. Don't use this for access control typically. For that, don't register the views in the navigator in the first place.
Yeah, there is too much kind of space for errors in this.
Yeah. Also, define an error view. This is really important. So if you can switch over to my screen, I'll show you what happens if you don't do this.
So this is basically the 404 for Vaadin.
Yeah. So if you don't define an error view for your application, this is what happens. So that's
beautiful.
It is very beautiful, but for many non-technical users, that might also be pretty scary. So by defining an error view, the error view is just a normal view, implementing view. And here you can then, in some sane fashion, handle that error, give the user some...
I guess we could have a better default for that.
I guess we could, but since we don't, please do remember to define the error view. Otherwise, the users will get a little bit of a bad user experience there.
So I guess the top question people always ask, and many of you have asked before this webinar as well, how should I organize my code? What's the best practice for this? Is there some kind of design pattern that I could use? And yes, there is. One of the most popular ones is MVP, Model View Presenter. Just to kind of repeat, everybody knows more or less what is MVP. But the basic idea is that you have a view as separate from the model as possible. So you keep these two guys separate so that you don't mix how you actually show things on the screen and what comes out of the backend. And these two guys are connected with the presenter that kind of delegates between those two guys. So this tries to make it possible that these are as separate as possible, and they could be changed when needed.
Yeah.
In practice, view is always an interface, so you have to implement that. And this makes it possible for you to actually change the view, so you could have a second implementation of it. And the implementation itself quite often refers back to the presenter or model to be able to kind of pull data from that or change back changes to presenter what happened. And the point over here is that you can create second view implementation that basically implements the same view in a different kind of way.
But how often does it really happen?
Yeah, I guess if you are making testable UIs, you might want to build.
Yeah, I mean, from a testing standpoint, it's usually easier to mock out a interface than a class, but most new mocking frameworks would allow you to mock out the view itself. So you may simplify this probably a little bit by not having the interface in between if you're sure that you're only going to create a Vaadin.
Yeah, but if you're doing that, then it's that's not like proper MVP if you want to kind of follow that pattern. In any case, the point over here is that there is quite a few classes, so it's quite complicated. There are a couple of reasons why you might consider using MVP. First is making UI testable. So this isolation allows you to replace this view with the test class or mocked class. Also, it kind of defines a clear separation between the UI logic and the setting up the UI or kind of layouts of the UI. So these might be correct reasons to use MVP. There are also wrong reasons for using MVP. These have been quite often argued to be the reasons to use the MVP. Basically, people say that if you're using MVP, you could replace this view later on with some other technology. You would be kind of safe for choosing one framework and then you could just replace that with second one. Or you could think that you could build mobile views in a way that they could reuse the same presenter. In practice, neither of these reasons is really practical. If you're replacing framework, you're always going to rewrite the UI layer.
Yeah, and I mean, the needs of the views tend to be still quite different from each other, so you can still kind of see the framework choice in the presenter, even though it doesn't necessarily directly mention it.
And the clear downside of MVP is that you are adding a lot of complexity in your application. So you basically gain something, but you also lose quite a bit. And the thing is that the things that you gain, you can actually use simpler ways of getting the same benefits. So you don't have to use MVP to be able to kind of make testable UIs or having clear separation. So let's take a look at this complexity. MVP originates, or it fits really well with the page-oriented UIs. I mean, if you're building a JSP, it's really nice thing to have a web page separate from the presenter, a presenter being on the server side, and then the model being separate from the presenter. So it fits that model quite well. When you kind of go into component-oriented UIs and try to use the same pattern, you end up kind of repeating the same pattern for each component. And I think it's quite clear that over here there is quite a lot of complexity. So you end up having a lot of classes and a lot of dependencies between those classes. It becomes complicated. People are always asking, is there a better way of doing this? I think there is, and I would recommend, if you are not certain that you really want to use MVP, instead try to organize your code by the UI components that you are having. It's a component-oriented framework in any case. So let's say if you are building a order management panel, you might have an order list over there, some kind of filtering configuration, some type of editor on the screen. So these are the components that you are seeing on the screen. Use the same components as a way to organize your code. So you can just have these components as classes, each basically a UI component over there, and then build proper APIs between these classes so that they can access each other when needed and have the separation in a way that order list doesn't have to know anything about the order filtering and vice versa. The second thing is, one thing to mention is, of course, there is a backend always. So all of these, they can access the same backend, or you might slice the backend in different kind of pieces. So it's up to your application what's the best way of kind of ordering the backend. Second principle that I would encourage you to follow is that start from the simplest possible way of organizing your code. In this case, it might mean that you just write all the code regarding to one part of the UI in one class. So you might have the separation between the layout and the actions just by having these in two different methods, and that's all right if your class and if your component is simple.
Yeah.
When it grows, then refactor. So first question to ask when the class starts to be long and you want to organize the code in a better fashion, can I divide this into multiple components? Could I split this in a kind of logical way? Mm-hmm. If that's not feasible, if it's like one unit that cannot be broken into parts, you might want to then create the presenter, and this can be done as an inner class, nested class over there. So that's really nice way of separating the presenter, but just organize the code in a bit different way. It's really, really simple to refactor this. So don't do it early on. Do it when you need it.
Yeah, I would argue the same for just in general. When you're writing Vaadin UI, start with the kind of concrete implementation. When you feel like you're writing the same type of component or functionality somewhere else, that's when you want to kind of refactor the commonalities into one common. I've too many times I see people trying to kind of predict all the possible things that this component might need.
Yeah, let's build this architecture
in the future, and what they end up with is overly complex structure of abstract classes and interfaces that just in the end ends up making development slower. So I prefer starting with something concrete, simple, and as I actually see that there's a need to refactor something, then I do that.
If this becomes too complicated, basically you would have a really long class with the nested class. You can then separate these easily and have this presenter as a completely separate class.
So,
one thing to point out over here, it's not necessary at all to have all the components kind of structured in the same way. It's much better to have simple components as one class and the really complicated ones as separate classes. So if you're applying the same pattern, same way of organizing the code to all the classes, you end up basically over-abstracting when it's not necessary for those components.
So all of this seems very abstract. Do you have any links or anything that we could use to see this in action?
Yeah, there is a really good blog post by Petter Holmström at Vaadin blog. So just search for MVP in Vaadin blog and you'll find it. There is also a lot of notes out how to make this testable. So layouts.
Yeah. So like Joonas just mentioned, you want to?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like Joonas mentioned, he prefers splitting the UI up in components. And in Vaadin terms, there are basically two different ways you can do that. You can either extend a custom component and define what the root of that component is, basically build your component within a custom component. And the other option is just extending an existing Vaadin component. I personally prefer the second option, so I just normally I extend Vaadin component directly and add my custom functionality there. But in some cases, doing the custom component can be really handy because that really allows you to specify exactly which methods an outside
it kind
user
of
is.
an extra abstraction, so you kind of hide things that you don't want to give to the user of the component.
Yeah. The downside there is that it's a little bit more complex. So things like sizing, you need to remember that you need to size both the custom component and the composition root definitely. And from a DOM standpoint, it's also a little bit different.
Yeah, it adds one extra layer in the DOM. So it's a bit slower for the end user.
A bit. So I mean, normally if you have a fairly flat hierarchy in your UI, it's not going to make a very big difference. Of course, if you start having hundreds of these and they're nested very deep, for instance, within a table, you'll start seeing a difference.
So I would say that the rule of thumb between choosing these two practices is that if you are building such a component that you as a developer are the only user of that component, you might not want to bother using a custom component. You can just extend some layout. But if this is a component that the rest of the team is using, other teams are using in your, or you are distributing that outside of your team completely, then you want to clean up the API so that they don't call any methods from the layouts directly.
Yeah.
One thing to note is that this is a problem that we're actually working on. So in the future versions of Vaadin, we are probably introducing Composite that just takes away this extra div from there and deals with all those problems that Markus mentioned, that you wouldn't have to do any compromising in this anymore.
Good. Then two very small handy methods that are available in all the default layouts, so vertical, horizontal, form, grid layout, are the margin and spacing attributes. Especially spacing, I think, is usually best to put on. So
that should be the default, but we cannot change that.
Yeah, we cannot change that anymore. So if you want to just jump over to my screen, I'll just show you quickly what the difference is. So in here right now, I don't have spacing on, so you can see all the fields are touching each other. The button is touching everything. It doesn't look good, and it's especially say you're on a mobile device, you're trying to hit these targets with your finger, which isn't the smallest pointer in the world. It becomes really hard. So if we turn on spacing for these, you can see that immediately by just turning that on, we get more breathing room between all the components. It looks nicer. The targets that we need to hit with our pointer become larger. Margin, again, is the spacing between the layout and its outer edge, so that will give you some space between the outer edge here and the component itself. Okay, good. So I wanted to do just a couple of words on sizing and layouts. This isn't necessarily a best practice in itself, but I think a lot of people, even people who've been using Vaadin for a long time, don't really understand what's going on, how the components end up where they end up, why they end up there. So let's spend 2-3 minutes looking at how and why things end up where they end up. So I have a
complicated Hello World application, it seems.
Yes. So here I have a label and a button, and what I want to do is I want to have this button be all the way over here and be 20% wide. So what we typically see people do is they put the label to be 80% wide and the button to be 20% wide, and that's a reasonable expectation, I guess.
Yeah, if everybody has the same screen, I guess.
But nothing happened, so this clearly wasn't a very good approach. Now the one thing here is, of course, since our layout, by default the horizontal layout, will only be as wide as it needs to be to kind of hold these components, there's no way we can have this button go outside that layout. So we need to first tell the layout that it needs to be 100% wide, which leads us to the next confusing thing happening. So now all of a sudden we have a slightly smaller than normal button that's in the middle of the screen.
That looks even more ugly.
Why is that? So to kind of clarify what's going on here, I'm going to inject some CSS directly into the page. This is a bad practice. Don't do this. But for the sake of clarity, let's do it. So here you can see the blue line is basically the layout itself, and the red boxes here are the slots within the layout that each component gets. So with these added, it becomes more clear that they're not just randomly put there. Both components get an equal amount of space within the layout. So the way we need to approach this then is that we need to set expand ratios. Now a very normal thing in a Vaadin UI is that you give one component all the kind of extra space that's available in a layout. And
so basically there is some space that is not used, and the expand ratios, the component with the expand ratios, they basically are dividing this extra space between them.
Yeah. So if we tell the label gets all the extra space, typically the kind of convention here is using 1 for the expand ratio, and then refreshing this, we'll get the button to actually go all the way here to the side, because the slot for the label now pushes all the way to the side. So if we wanted it to be 20% wide, what we actually need to do is make sure that the ratios are right. So we have 0.8 and 0.2. That should, according to my math, give the button 20% of the UI. So let's refresh that. But you can still see that the button doesn't take up all that 20%. And
so basically the slot gets the 20%, not the button itself.
Correct. So in order to get to the end result that we actually wanted to get to, we still need to tell the button to be 100% wide in order to take up all that space that it had. So really, the takeaway here is that when dealing with sizing, there are 2 sizes that you need to think of: the size of the slot in the layout and the size of the component that's within that slot.
Also, Chrome Inspector is your friend, so that helps you to understand why the layout is actually rendering in some particular way. So you can just inspect and see how the sizes are actually set in the layout. And
the same goes for alignment. So if we wanted to center the label here, it's going to be centered within that slot that it's occupying, not in the center of the page.
Yeah. So could you show the code again? There's quite a bit of code. I mean, it's really hard for me to see what actually happens on the screen just by reading the code. This is one of the kind of critique that we have had with Vaadin for a long time, because we have been really oriented towards programmatic way of building layouts. Now with Vaadin, basically starting from 7.4, you can also do layouts in a declarative fashion. So instead of writing everything in Java code, you can also define layout in declarative manner. For example, if you are building this form over here, let's see. Sorry, wrong screen. So if you are building this form over here, building this form in Java would make it quite hard to actually read what's happening over there. Building this in HTML, in this case this actually is HTML, you can more or less see what's happening over here. Downside is that writing this HTML is actually quite hard, so it's pretty error prone because you don't have static typing and you might not kind of remember what kind of attributes you have for each component and so forth. So it's kind of compromise. How you actually use this declarative definition is from Java. So basically you create some class that is basically the outmost class over here. This is a vertical layout, so you should use vertical layout. You declare this as a design root, so you add this design root annotation over there, and in the constructor you say designed.read this. So it basically goes out and reads HTML file with the same name, shipping form.html, and it renders that on the component. It adds those references that you have over there in the class to point directly to the components in the created component tree. So all of this happens automatically. The only thing is that how to kind of keep all of this together in a way that you don't break it, so it's a bit tricky. So how should you, when you should actually use declarative layouts, I think that there are a couple of cases where they are really handy. So first off, you add a nice separation between the layout and the logic. So if you don't have any other separation between the layout and the UI logic, this might be the separation that you're looking for. The second thing is that this works really well with the new Vaadin Designer. So basically, with Vaadin Designer, instead of writing this HTML, you can just draw it.
Yeah.
And it keeps this Java file in sync with the design at all times. So you are not able to make any extra errors, but you get like static typing at all the time. So it kind of basically reduces the bad sides of using declarative.
Yeah.
And as we already saw from Mario's code, declarative would be quite a bit more readable than Java code.
Especially for non-Java developers. So if you need to have a discussion about the UI with, say, a UI designer or somebody who knows HTML but don't necessarily know Java code, that's also.
So one thing to point out, Java would be more writable. I mean, especially if you're using a proper IDE, it kind of auto-completes everything, so it's really easy to write that code, although you might not end up with the results that you wanted to have, as we saw from the layouting example. So when not to use declarative layouts, first off, if the layout is dynamic in a way that it changes based on data or user permissions or anything that happens in your application, then using a declarative layout might be a bit too complicated, so it might be easier just to kind of create.
I mean, in that case, you would basically, in that declarative layout, you would have to have all the permutations visible, and then in Java code hide or show them. And
that would be quite a hack.
Yeah, and it wouldn't be all that legible, which is really what we're trying to accomplish there. So.
Yeah. Also, if your component is quite simple, then you might be better off just writing the whole layout in Java code.
Yeah.
And of course, if you are kind of slicing your application in a nice sized pieces, I mean, iteratively split the components to smaller components, it might be quite applicable that most of those components are written by hand.
Yeah.
One thing in particular where you want to use declarative is when you are building forms and dialogues and that kind of stuff, where you have many components on the same layout. Over there, declarative is really, really powerful, especially if you are using designer with that.
Yeah. But that being said, I mean, I wouldn't say that using the Java programmatic way is ever wrong, but in some cases the declarative might be easier.
Exactly.
So if you have all your code in Java, don't go and rewrite
No.
all of it.
If it works, don't break it. So.
Yeah.
So the question comes, what would be the best practices for actually organizing your code and naming your code? When you're writing things by hand, I would say that the best way of doing that is to have exactly one file named HTML and one file named one Java file with the exactly same name. So this way, and this is actually the default that the design root kind of expects. And it's a simple and nice separation between the layout and the code. If you're using Designer, you have a benefit of Designer actually writing these automatically for you.
Yeah.
So you are not writing any of this. It's automatically generated and it's kept in sync automatically. The thing is that where should you write your code? You definitely shouldn't be modifying this Java file, because then Designer will overwrite this again. So that would be breaking. Instead, what you should do is have a separate Java component that is using the design that you create with the designer.
Yeah.
And there are two ways of using that. Either you can extend directly as that's Markus's preference, or if you want to use custom component, then you can have this component named.
So again, the same two ways that we showed earlier. So in all senses, this is just a normal Vaadin component that's just declared in a different way.
Yeah. One thing to note over here, you should follow naming convention where you are adding design in the end of the generated component. That way you can keep the code or the component that you are writing with the best possible and shortest possible name, and this auto-generated just revert from that.
So one question with the designer, we end up with quite a few files. How would you organize those in your project so it stays manageable?
As you see, the names actually keep them together in a way. I would keep them in the same package.
So would you create a separate package for each component just so you have the three files in one place? Or
No. I would keep things that are related to same logical kind of set of components together in one package. It might be Vue or it might be something else.
Okay.
Also, one thing to note is that while on the designer side it looks like there is one more class or more complexity over there, this most of the complexity is in these out-generated files. So this component name.java, that would end up being really, really thin. Only things that you write by hand, only things that are not auto-generated end up over there. So it's nice and clean. And because it's extending or using this generated Java code, you get all the benefit of static typing.
Yep.
There is also a blog post about this, so search for Vaadin Declarative 101 from Vaadin blog. It kind of repeats this and gives more code examples.
Okay.
Forms.
Yeah, so another very common question that we get is how to deal with forms, especially if you have data types that aren't just the basic integers and strings. How do you deal with those? How do you edit them? And how do you deal with validation? So let's take a look at those two things. The first thing is that Vaadin has a very powerful concept called a custom field. So this is very much the same as a custom component.
Kind of composite field.
Composite field, yeah. It implements abstract field, I think, or extends abstract field for the type that you define. And in there you can then, for instance, build an embedded form, if you will, where you deal with the complexities of editing that specific data type that you have in your application. So in my specific application, the one that is up on GitHub and the one I'll show you really soon, well, you can jump all the way over here. I have we're dealing with orders here, and each order has several line items. So there's no basic field type for just a list, especially not for a list of order items. So in this case, I created my own line item field that has a vertical layout that contains all the things that are needed for adding line items to this order.
So that's like a first-class real field.
Yeah,
with all the features.
yeah, and the idea, of course, is that I write this once in my application, then wherever else we need to deal with line items, we can just reuse that field as if it was a normal field. So if you look at the basic form here, the form only has two fields. It has one for the order status and one for the line items, and those are bound to the properties in the item that I have.
So this actually goes back to the code organization. That's one nice way of dividing your view to smaller pieces, and this one kind of a custom field would be really good way of kind of bundling all the things together.
You probably already noticed that this form that I have here is not very nice to use. Before I've even started entering anything into this form, it's already complaining that I did things wrong. So
in a really nice manner, that exclamation mark is a pretty funny place.
Yeah. So that's one thing that we could probably do a little bit better, but there are, of course, ways that you could work around this. Also, it allows me to submit the form even though things are clearly wrong here. So let's...
pretty nice validation error, by the way.
Thank you. So let's take a look at a better alternative, hopefully. Let's see if this refreshes. So now you can see there's no validation error here. Also, I can't submit this because it's not completed yet. So in order for me to actually be able to submit this, I need to get the form to a valid state.
So could you show again, what did you do?
Yeah, I wanted to show what the end result is, and then...
I thought it was so quick that...
Yeah, well, this contains a little bit of magic. Basically, you have to do a little bit of magic to make this happen, but basically I hide the validation for a field until it has been changed at least once, so we're not showing people that they did something wrong before they actually tried to enter some value at least once. I also make the fields immediate so that we get the response immediately when they're filling them. And then I have basically loop through the form and attach listeners to the fields there. And whenever something changes, I check is the form as a whole valid. And based on that, I enable or disable the button. Unfortunately, in order to keep this fairly kind of simple and readable, this isn't like a fully featured solution. So you can, for extra credit, you can go in and look at Mattis Viritin add-on. But
that's a really nice collection of best practices bundled in a kind of
it's kind of the commons library for Vaadin. There are a very assorted collection of all kinds of helper methods for kind of more productive Vaadin use.
So I guess you should go and take a look more closely at that code from the project.
Yeah, so it's going to be a little bit too much to go through in a lot of detail here. What I just wanted to highlight is that there are some things that you can do quite easily with helper tools to make the validation much more user-friendly and just prevent people from doing mistakes in the first place by not allowing them.
And this kind of generic, you can apply the same thing to all the forms that you have so that they behave in a kind of coherent fashion.
Yeah, so that's correct. Okay.
So datasets. This is one of the hard questions that people always have.
Yeah, and it's a question that we always have.
Yeah.
So basically, when you're dealing with large data sets, we're not talking about tens, we're talking about thousands or hundreds of thousands. The kind of considerations you need to take are quite a bit different than if you had, say, 10 items in your database. So in my application here, I have three kind of approaches that people typically do in their applications. The first is the kind of brute force first way that most people start off
So you
writing
just
their
put
application.
the items in there.
So items in their
Put the
application.
items in there.
So basically what we do here is we have some order service that we call to get all the orders, and we wrap them in a bean item container and just set that to the table that we have. If we can,
Yeah, I can switch over that.
yeah.
So I think it would be fair to say that this is totally okay if you have just few.
Yeah,
items.
this is probably a good starting point just to get something quickly showing, and if you then in your testing show that this is actually a problem, you can go ahead and do something about that. So let's see what happens when we run this. So you can see when I click the orders, it takes quite a while. You can see the progress bar going there, and about 5 seconds later, because I have a 5 second.
Okay. I thought you have a really, really slow database over there.
It's simulating a very slow database. But
Yep.
once we have everything loaded, things are fast. We get all the data here, and we're able to work with it.
So basically you copied everything from the database to the memory.
Yeah, and to make things worse, I wrapped it in a container, which adds some additional memory overhead. So
Yep.
it ends up using some data. But I think the worst thing here is that, especially if you're dealing with non-technical users, the fact that the progress bar just gets stuck blinking there, to many people indicate that they did something wrong, the system broke, they're going to have a bad time, they're probably going to press the orders button 5 times more and
Yeah, and end up making 5 more queries over there.
exactly. So it's for a large data set, this isn't really a very optimal solution. Kind of the next step that you could do is
Kind of really slight improvement over there.
a very slight improvement, but at least from a usability standpoint, we're telling the user that, hey, there's something happening, we're fetching the orders, it's going to take a while, and once we're actually fetched those, we're going to show the table. So from a memory consumption standpoint, we've improved nothing, but at least from the user experience point, we've already improved this. So
Could you show that again? Navigate somewhere else and come back. So immediately when you click, you get this hang on, fetching on orders.
yeah, so the navigation happens instantaneously. The user gets a response. We're showing that something is happening, and we can.
Yeah, let's switch over here.
Yeah. So on a kind of conceptual level, how this works, I abbreviated the code a little bit for the slide, but you can look at the full code.
Yeah, there is one error over there. But
Yeah. So anyway, the idea here is that instead of just calling the order service synchronously, we have an async method that returns a future, and here I'm using Guava's future callback to attach a success and failure listener to that future. So whenever it successfully completes, what we do is we again create the container, and then we replace the progress bar component that we have with the table.
so basically you are doing this in the background thread. You could manage the threads by yourself,
Correct.
of course, if you want to. One thing to note over there, because this code doesn't actually work, the one thing that is missing is that when a background thread is accessing your UI, you should always use UI.access method.
Yeah.
It basically makes this thread safe.
Yeah. The other thing that's not here is that you need to have either polling or push enabled for this to happen. So if you just update your UI from a background thread and don't have either of those enabled,
nothing happens on
then
the
nothing
screen.
happens until you trigger some event from the client. So that's something to keep in mind. And like I said, all of this is in the GitHub project, so you can. So I think this is still a fair solution if you have a somewhat large data set, or you're just calling some legacy system that just takes very long to call, and you can't really do anything about that. It's still an improvement, and if you only have like 2 or 3 users for a system, maybe it's a perfectly okay solution.
And this is also kind of a quick way to iteratively make your application better. So if you just started with the simplest possible solution, put things in the memory, and you notice that, hey, there is a bit of lag when we are loading this, this is something that you can implement real quick and add on top of your existing code base.
Yeah. So the final approach here,
The real correct way
kind of
to do things.
kind of the correct solution is to use a lazy loading container. So in Vaadin, for accessing data, we're using an abstraction layer called container, basically. You saw us using bean item container earlier, and that's something that just wraps a set of Java objects, a list of Java objects into a container. The problem there is, of course, it loads all of those into memory at once. So in this case, I'm using, again, something from that Viritin add-on by Matti, just because this is a very simple, from a kind of implementation standpoint, very easy for me to kind of explain what's going on here. So instead of just pulling all the database into memory and populate the container, we tell the container that you should call fetch orders to get the next batch of orders, and call get order count to get the full size of the data set that we have. And if we go back to my screen here.
So one thing that I want to point out first is that basically the only change between this and the previous one is where the data resides. In the previous ones, we actually copied the data into the container itself, that being so it's once in the memory per user session.
Yeah.
Over here we keep the data where it's originally, and we copy that whenever we are needing.
Yeah.
That.
And basically only the parts that we're needing.
Yeah. And even if you're copying everything in memory, it's still lazy when it comes to fetching or moving that data to the browser side. So even if you're copying everything in the memory, you're copying that to the server memory, and when you're scrolling through the table, it actually sends pieces over.
Yeah, that's a good point to make out.
So there are multiple kind of layers of laziness.
Yeah.
Let me switch back to your screen.
So just to show you what happens when we go to the lazy loaded container here is that navigation is pretty instantaneous again, and as we're scrolling here, we're actually fetching. So if I go really quick, you'll see that it takes a while to get those. I've used a proportional amount of time, so fetching those 20 or so items takes a proportional number to that 5 seconds that we have earlier. So this is kind of scaled to, so this is a realistic kind of expectation. If fetching the whole data set would take 5 seconds, then fetching the batch would take roughly this long. So.
And basically the user experience when you are navigating to this view is so much better than either of the first approaches.
Yeah, I mean, here you get the data that you wanted immediately.
It goes so fast that so basically it just loads.
Yeah, correct.
A couple of notes over here. First is if you have those, let's say 100,000 lines on the screen, does it really make sense?
No, so I mean, an example that I like to do about this is that if you want to know the lunch menu for the restaurant across the street, you're not going to go into Google, type in restaurant, and hit your way all the way to page 47,000. There's a very good chance. There's a very good chance that you're going to actually search by the name of the restaurant and maybe the city, and you're going to end up with a list of maybe 5 hits, and you're going to find the restaurant very much quicker that way.
So kind of if you end up having 100,000 lines on your grid, that's a really good indication that something is kind of wrong with your UX design.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you can't avoid it, but a lot of times you can avoid the problem altogether by providing much better search tools, and maybe you only need to return like 50 lines in that case. All of this discussion is more or less pointless, and you can just use the bean item container. And
so if you kind of jump back to the best practices, I think what we are trying to say over here is that start from the simplest solution and then kind of make it better when you actually need it.
Yeah.
And even though it would be tempting to create lazy loading containers always to be able to kind of in a correct way load data lazily, it might be the wrong way. It might be that much better refactoring of your application is to refactor user experience in a such way that you don't end up loading 100,000 lines on your screen.
Yeah, right. I think we're still on my screen.
Yeah. So we had quite a few questions about theming as well. It's such a large topic that we wouldn't have time to go through theming best practice right now, but luckily we already did a really nice webinar about theming and Valo. So take a look at that. Jouni Koivuviita, the author of the Valo theme, and Teemu Pöntele, they are discussing how to actually use Valo theme, how to build your own themes on top of that, and what are the best practices. It's a good webinar, take a look at that. Also regarding the user experience, our a couple of guys from our design team, Rolf Smeds and Manuel Rickert, they are showcasing many of the best practices and tips and tricks how to make your user experience better. So that would be a really nice webinar to looking at, even if you kind of think that you are a developer, you shouldn't be thinking about the user experience. Take a peek of that.
Yeah,
anyways.
I mean there are some very small, easy things you can do that quite drastically improve the
user
UX.
experience should be easy, and everybody should be thinking about the user experience.
Yeah.
Then we had a lot of miscellaneous questions that we couldn't kind of put into any particular category, so let's just take a look at those. First off, how should we handle internationalization?
I mean, the typical thing that we see in Vaadin applications is that you load the kind of keys from a properties file somewhere, and then instead of hard coding all the strings in your UI, you're pulling those from a bundle that has then been configured based on either the locale of the browser or selection by the user themselves.
And in a way, this is not a Vaadin related best practice by any means. So there is a lot of tooling for translating Swing applications. You can use exactly the same tooling.
Yeah.
There is one thing I want to point out as a best practice. You should avoid trying to kind of translate on the fly. What I mean with this is that when your use case is that I want to switch language from, let's say, English to French on the fly, instead of kind of going through the component tree and trying to retranslate the same component tree, it might not make sense. Instead, it might be much better to just reload the whole user interface.
Yeah, and as long as you've used the navigator and call that navigate to get state, once you refresh, you're going to end up on the same view, just with a new language. So I think that's a fair compromise.
Basically, something that it would be a good practice of actually translating on the fly using the same components. There is some merit to that, but
it adds more complexity
it's
than
so complex that you should avoid that if anyhow possible.
Yeah.
Then the next question about how to create custom components with JWT. I guess this is pretty much covered in the book of Vaadin.
Yeah, and in the wiki for Vaadin 7. So we can probably add some links to the forum on that.
Question about the thread safety. No, components are not thread safe. So this is quite important to note that whenever you have a background thread that tries to access the UI, you should never go and access that directly. It might seem to work when you try it once or twice, but that it's as always with the thread safety problems, sometimes it doesn't work. So for that there is UI.access method that you should be using, and that makes that access thread safe.
Yep.
How to compile widgets with Gradle. There luckily is a really nice Gradle plugin by John Alrus. You might want to take a look at that. There is support for widgets built in, so the documentation should answer that question directly.
Yeah.
How to compile widgets in IntelliJ IDEA. I don't know about you, but my preference is to use Maven with IntelliJ.
that was what I was going to say. So normally I just use the Maven, a Maven project, and that kind of takes care of the compilation for me.
Yeah, so it's basically compilation target would be Vaadin compile.
Yeah.
And it compiles the widget. How to use Vaadin and Liferay. That's also covered pretty well at the book of Vaadin. There is a couple of things to mention about this as well. Because then you have to make a choice whether you want to have your widget set in your portlet, or you want to have that on the portal level, or if you want to use the widget that is built into Liferay. So there are three options. I would say never use the widget that built into Liferay. You should always upgrade the Vaadin because it's really, really old version that is bundled with the Liferay.
Yeah.
Regarding whether you want to use one widget per portlet or one per portal, that's more of a question how your team is working. Is it just one team working on the whole portal, or is it like a set of teams that are building different parts, different portlets in that portal? So if it's only one team, I would encourage to put the widget set in the portal. That way it's only loaded once, and
Yeah.
it's a faster user experience. If you have a really big team, or it's a like portal shared by the whole company, you might want to, for the sake of easier maintenance, have the widget set per portlet.
Yeah.
What else? I guess those were the only questions that we had, or most of the questions that
Yeah, I mean, we'll probably end up getting some more in the forum, and we'll try to answer those today or tomorrow. And
yeah, so you can just add your questions below in the forum thread if you're looking this at the Vaadin forums. I guess takeaway from the whole webinar is that I would say that there are no best practices that are so universal that they should be applied to all the applications.
yeah, but there are some things that
There
work better than others. So.
Exactly, there are those potholes, there are
Yeah.
the worst practices, so there are things to avoid. I think
Yeah, what we both agree on, I think, is try to keep things as simple as possible. Refactor. So don't start off with an overly complex solution. Try to keep things simple.
exactly. And question things. If somebody comes and says that this is the best practice that should be used by the old application, here is the design pattern that just should be used, it might not make any sense for your application. So try to find that simpler way of doing things
Yeah.
that fits your application.
Yeah, and finally, I would just recommend ask for help before you're in trouble. So, I mean, like Joonas said, we've been doing this for 15 years now. We've been working with customers on their projects. We've had 15 years of time to make more or less all the mistakes that you can make with the framework. So instead of you spending a year time on figuring out how to integrate with something or how to implement something, just ask us and we'll.
Yeah, it's so much easier to fix when you're building the foundation, not after you have built the whole house and you have to change the foundation. So
Exactly.
So thank you very much for
Thanks.
listening. I hope we had pointed out to some potholes, and I hope that was useful.
Yeah, and there are some more things in the demo application that I'm going to link to, like rendering optimization and memory usage and things like that. You can go in and look at those.
Yeah, and we'll add the links to the blog posts we mentioned throughout the webinar as well.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.